They say a man's true character shows in the moment he believes no one will challenge him. And on that dry Arizona evening, inside a dusty saloon 20 miles from the nearest railroad, Ethan Blackwood believed exactly that. The room smelled of oak barrels, tobacco smoke, and the long desert day that still clung to every pair of boots on the wooden floor. Glasses tapped softly, chairs creaked, and a lazy ceiling fan turned like it had all the time in the world. Ethan leaned one elbow on the bar, silver spurs catching the lantern light, his voice low enough to sound private, but loud enough for half the room to hear. "I want some sugar, so I'm having you tonight." A few men chuckled behind their glasses, the way men do when they think money makes a joke respectable. Across from him stood Nia Redfeather, 20 years old, her dark hair tied back with a thin strip of red cloth, the desert dust still on the hem of her skirt after a long walk that had started before sunrise. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached slowly into the pocket of her worn coat and placed a small object onto the bar between them. It was no larger than a silver dollar, sealed with deep red wax that caught the lantern light like a drop of sunset. The bartender's hand froze halfway to a glass. Someone near the door stopped shuffling cards. Even the fan above seemed to slow. Ethan noticed the silence and smirked, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve like he owned the air in the room. "That's supposed to impress me?" he asked. Nia's eyes stayed steady, calm as still water. "It's payment," she said quietly. The bartender leaned closer, his face losing color inch by inch as he recognized the seal pressed into the wax. He glanced toward Ethan, then toward the door as if calculating how far 20 feet might feel when trouble started walking. Ethan, however, only laughed and slid the token a few inches across the bar with one finger. "Sweetheart," he said, "there isn't a piece of metal in this territory worth more than my word." From the far corner, a chair scraped against the floor. A travel-worn doctor named Amos Klein, who had been sipping coffee in silence for the last 10 minutes, suddenly stood still as stone. His eyes locked onto the red wax seal, and the cup in his hand slowly lowered back onto the table. The room felt smaller now, the lantern light sharper, the air thicker. Nia spoke again, softer than before. "Don't touch it." But Ethan Blackwood had spent his life believing warnings were meant for other men. With a careless grin, he reached forward, thumb pressing toward the seal, as if he were about to crack it open like a peanut shell. The instant his skin brushed the wax, Dr. Klein's voice cut through the room like a church bell at dawn. "Son," he said slowly, stepping closer to the bar, eyes fixed on the mark stamped into the wax. "Do you have any idea whose authority you just put your hand on?" The room held its breath after the doctor spoke, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel louder than it should be. Ethan Blackwood's hand paused on the red wax seal, his confident smile still resting on his face, but now it looked a little thinner around the edges. "Authority," he repeated with a quiet chuckle, as if the word itself amused him. "Doctor, the only authority that matters in this town is the man who keeps it running." A few men at the far table nodded automatically, though none of them sounded eager to agree out loud anymore. Dr. Amos Klein stepped closer to the bar, boots moving slow and steady across the worn floorboards. He was not a tall man, and he did not carry a gun, but something about the way he looked at that wax seal made the lantern light seem sharper around his face. "That mark," the doctor said calmly, "belongs to a territorial office that does not answer to any rancher, banker, or saloon owner inside 200 miles. The bartender swallowed hard and wiped his hands on a towel that had suddenly become very interesting. Ethan glanced down again at the small token beneath his fingers. The wax carried a symbol pressed deep into it, a narrow crest surrounded by letters that most people in the room could not read, but somehow understood anyway. For a moment the rich cowboy said nothing. Then he leaned back slightly and laughed again, louder this time, the kind of laugh meant to convince a room that nothing had changed. "You mean to tell me this little piece of wax is supposed to scare me?" he said. Nia Redfeather stood exactly where she had been, hands resting quietly at the edge of the bar. Her eyes did not move from the token. "It is not meant to scare you," she said softly. "It is meant to remind you." The doctor nodded once, slowly. "Your father would have recognized it," he added. That made Ethan's smile fade by a fraction. The men who had been watching from their chairs shifted slightly, boots scraping against wood as they leaned forward without realizing it. Dr. Klein rested both hands on the bar, looking from the wax seal to Ethan and then briefly toward Naya. 20 years ago, the doctor continued, that seal was placed on a document that promised protection under territorial law. It was given to a woman who needed the law to remember her name. The bartender stopped wiping glasses entirely now. Even the ceiling fan above seemed to turn more carefully, as if the air itself was listening. Ethan's voice lowered when he spoke again. I do not see any document here, he said. Just a girl holding a coin. Naya lifted the small token with 2 fingers and turned it slowly so the seal faced the room. The red wax glowed under the lantern like a tiny sunset caught in metal. The document still exists, she said quietly. But the man who wrote it said the seal would be enough. Dr. Klein exhaled through his nose, almost like a man remembering something he had hoped to forget. And that man, he said, looking directly at Ethan now, was a judge who did not care how rich a rancher was. A faint breeze slipped through the swinging saloon doors, carrying the smell of dry desert grass from the dark street outside. Inside the room, no one moved. Ethan Blackwood looked down at the seal once more, and for the first time that evening the man who believed he owned the town realized the smallest object on the bar might weigh more than all the gold in his pockets. The silence in the saloon stretched longer than anyone expected, the kind of silence that makes a man suddenly aware of every small movement he makes. Ethan Blackwood slowly removed his hand from the bar, though he tried to make it look like the gesture meant nothing. His fingers brushed a grain of dust from his sleeve, as if the conversation had already bored him. A judge from 20 years ago, he said calmly, though his voice had lost a little of its earlier ease. That sounds like a story meant for campfires, Doctor. The men at the far table exchanged glances. A moment ago they had laughed easily, but now they watched Ethan the way men watch the horizon before a storm, unsure whether the sky is truly changing or only imagining it. Dr. Amos Klein did not move away from the bar. He studied the red wax seal with a careful patience that made the room feel smaller. Some promises do not fade with time, the doctor said quietly, especially the ones written when a town was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to become. The bartender leaned slightly closer, curiosity now stronger than caution. I remember hearing something about that, he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Ethan heard it anyway. His eyes shifted across the room, measuring faces, counting loyalties the way a rancher counts cattle in the morning light. Funny, Ethan said with a thin smile. I have lived here my whole life and never heard this famous promise. Naya Redfeather lifted the small token again, turning it slowly so the lantern light ran across the hardened wax. The crest pressed into the seal looked older than the room itself. That is because the promise was not made to you, she said. Her voice remained calm, but something in it carried the weight of years that were not her own. Dr. Klein looked at her then, studying her face more carefully than before. Your mother, the doctor said softly, the memory forming in his eyes like a distant trail coming back into view. Naya nodded once. No one else in the saloon spoke. Outside the swinging doors the wind moved dust along the empty street, and somewhere far off a horse shifted its weight beside a hitching post. Ethan's smile returned, though now it looked carefully constructed. Doctor, he said slowly, you are telling this room that a piece of wax from 2 decades ago somehow gives this girl authority over my business tonight. He tapped the bar lightly with one knuckle as he spoke, the rhythm steady and deliberate. Dr. Klein shook his head. No, he replied. I am telling this room that 20 years ago a man with the power of the territory behind him wrote down something that people in this town chose to forget. The bartender finally spoke up, his voice uncertain but curious. What did the judge write? The question hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Naya placed the token back onto the bar, exactly where it had been before. He wrote that if anyone ever tried to take away the dignity he promised my mother, she said quietly, this seal would remind the town whose law was meant to protect it. Ethan stared at the token again, the faint crease between his brows deepening by a fraction. For the first time that evening, the richest man in the room realized that whatever story had been buried in the past might not have stayed buried after all. The lantern light inside the saloon flickered softly as the wind outside shifted direction, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush through the swinging doors. No one spoke for several seconds after Naya's words settled across the room. The token with the red wax seal rested quietly on the bar, yet it seemed to hold the attention of every man present more firmly than any gun ever could. Ethan Blackwood stared at it as though trying to decide whether it was truly real or only a clever trick meant to embarrass him. He slowly folded his arms across his chest and leaned back slightly, the polished silver on his belt catching the lantern glow. Stories have a way of growing bigger with time, Ethan said at last, his voice measured, almost thoughtful now. A promise from 20 years ago might sound impressive in a quiet room, but towns change. A faint murmur moved through the saloon. Some men nodded, relieved to hear confidence return to Ethan's voice, while others remained still, their eyes drifting back toward the red seal. Dr. Amos Klein remained where he stood beside the bar, his hands resting lightly on the wood, as if he were standing at the edge of a memory he had not visited in years. Yes, the doctor said slowly, towns do change. His gaze moved from Ethan to the faces of the men sitting at the nearby tables. But sometimes they change because people decide to forget things that once mattered. The bartender shifted uneasily, glancing again at the seal. I remember when the judge rode through here, he said carefully. Tall man, gray coat, spoke like every word was already written somewhere important. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. Traveling officials passed through every year back then, he replied. That does not mean they wrote laws meant to last forever. Naya Redfeather listened without interruption. The red ribbon tied in her hair moved slightly with the breeze that slipped through the door. Her hands rested calmly on the bar, close to the token but not touching it. He wrote more than words, she said quietly. The doctor looked at her again, his eyes narrowing with recognition that had been building since the moment he saw the seal. Your mother stood right here, he said, gesturing gently to the same stretch of wood where the token now rested. I remember the afternoon. The sun was so bright outside that the whole room looked like it was made of dust and gold. A few of the older men in the saloon shifted in their seats, listening now with the slow curiosity that comes when old memories begin to surface. Ethan remained silent, though the crease between his brows deepened again. Dr. Klein continued speaking, his voice calm but steady. Your mother asked only one thing from that judge, he said. Not land, not money. Just the promise that the law would remember her dignity even if the town chose not to. The bartender inhaled slowly. And the judge gave her that seal, he said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Naya nodded once. He said the seal would be enough if the town ever forgot, she replied. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt different from the one before. It carried the weight of recognition rather than uncertainty. Ethan Blackwood looked around the saloon now, measuring the mood of the men who had once laughed easily at his words. Some avoided his gaze. Others watched the token as though it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Ethan turned his attention back to Naya, studying her face carefully. If that story is true, he said slowly, then why bring the seal here tonight? Naya lifted the token gently and held it up so the red wax caught the lantern light once more. Her voice remained calm, but it carried clearly across the entire room. Because tonight, she said, this town was about to forget again. The words lingered in the warm lantern light, like dust floating in the air after a horse passes down a dry road. Because tonight this town was about to forget again. For a long moment no one spoke. Boots rested still on the floorboards. Glasses remained untouched on the bar. The little token with the red wax seal glowed softly between the lantern reflections, small enough to fit in a pocket, yet suddenly heavy enough to command the attention of every soul inside the saloon. Ethan Blackwood slowly unfolded his arms. The movement was calm, controlled, the kind of motion a man makes when he refuses to show that anything has changed. But those closest to him noticed something different now. His eyes were no longer fixed on Naya Redfeather alone. They were scanning the room, measuring the men who had laughed only minutes earlier, counting who still looked certain and who now studied the red seal with quiet curiosity. Ethan rested both hands on the edge of the bar and leaned forward slightly. The polished leather of his gloves creaked in the silence. You are telling me, he said carefully, that you walked nearly 20 miles across open desert just to remind a room full of men about a promise none of them signed. His tone was steady, but the room could hear the calculation beneath it. Naya did not raise her voice. She simply placed the token back on the bar exactly where it had been before, the wax crest facing outward so anyone could see it. Not a room, she answered. A town. The bartender drew in a slow breath and rubbed the back of his neck. Dr. Amos Klein remained beside the counter, his eyes thoughtful now, the way a man looks when old memories begin lining themselves up like fence posts along a forgotten road. She is not wrong, the doctor said quietly. The judge did not speak to just one person that afternoon. Half the town was standing outside the courthouse windows trying to hear him. One of the older ranch hands near the back table shifted in his chair. I remember my father mentioning that. He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Said the judge talked about dignity like it was something the law could carry in its pocket. Ethan let out a small breath through his nose. Not a laugh this time. Something closer to impatience. Dignity does not keep cattle fed or railroads moving, he said. The world runs on stronger things than words. The doctor looked at him carefully. That depends on the kind of town you want to live in. Outside the saloon, a breeze brushed across the street, rattling the loose sign above the door with a soft wooden knock. Inside, the air felt tighter now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Ethan glanced again at the red seal. For the first time since the conversation began, he did not reach toward it. Instead, he looked directly at Naya. And what exactly do you expect this town to do with that reminder? He asked. The question was calm but sharp, like the edge of a new blade. Naya lifted the token again, holding it between her fingers so the wax crest caught the lantern glow once more. Her expression remained steady, but something in her eyes carried the quiet strength of someone who had traveled a long road for a reason that could not be turned around now. Nothing, she said softly. The word surprised several men at the bar. Ethan's brow creased slightly. Nothing, he repeated. Naya lowered the token slowly back onto the wood. The seal does not demand anything, she said. It only asks the town to remember who it promised to be. And as the lantern light flickered across the red wax, a realization began to settle through the saloon that the smallest object in the room might soon force every man there to decide exactly that. The lantern above the bar swayed slightly as the wind outside pushed through the loose hinges of the saloon door, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. For several seconds after Naya spoke, no one in the room seemed certain what to say next. The words she had chosen were quiet, almost gentle, yet they carried a weight that made the air feel heavier than before. The seal does not demand anything. It only asks the town to remember who it promised to be. Ethan Blackwood studied the token again, his eyes tracing the edges of the red wax as though trying to measure the strength of something that had no obvious size. He was a man used to counting things that could be held in a hand or written in a ledger. Acres of land, head of cattle, dollars stacked in neat columns. But the small mark pressed into that wax did not belong to any ledger he controlled. Ethan straightened slowly, adjusting the cuff of his coat with deliberate calm. Memory, he said after a moment, letting the words settle on his tongue as if tasting it. That is a curious thing to travel 20 miles for. Naya Redfeather rested her hands lightly on the bar beside the token. Her long walk through the desert had left a faint line of dust along the hem of her skirt, but her posture remained steady, like someone who had already decided that the distance was worth it long before she stepped onto the road. Some things disappear when no one remembers them, she replied quietly. Dr. Amos Klein nodded slightly, his gaze still on the seal. And some things grow stronger when they are finally remembered, he added. A chair creaked softly near the back wall. One of the older men in the room leaned forward, elbows resting on the table as he studied the token more carefully than before. That judge, the man said slowly. I think my father said he rode through here during the summer of '82. The bartender looked up at that. The year the rail surveyors first came through the valley, he said, recalling the story as if pulling it from a dusty shelf in his mind. Ethan glanced briefly toward them, his expression neutral, but the room noticed the way he listened now instead of dismissing the conversation outright. Dr. Klein spoke again, his voice steady. That same summer the judge stood in front of the courthouse and told the town something simple, he said. He said that law without dignity is only power wearing a clean coat. The lantern flame flickered again, and the red wax seal caught the light so sharply that it looked almost alive against the wood. Naya lifted the token once more, turning it slowly so the crest faced the room. My mother kept this hidden for years, she said softly. She said it was not meant to change the past, Ethan watched her carefully now. Then why bring it here tonight? He asked. If it changes nothing? Naya held the seal between her fingers for a moment longer before placing it back onto the bar. Because sometimes a town does not need something to change, she answered. Sometimes it only needs to remember what it already promised. The saloon fell quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of men realizing that the story unfolding in front of them might ask something from each of them before the night was over. The quiet that settled over the saloon now felt deeper than before, as if the room itself had begun listening more carefully to the past than to the present. Outside, the desert wind moved slowly along the empty street, brushing dust against the wooden steps and carrying the faint smell of dry earth through the swinging doors. Inside, the red wax seal remained on the bar like a small, patient witness. Ethan Blackwood stood still for a long moment, his eyes resting on the token, but his thoughts clearly traveling somewhere farther away. He had built his reputation on certainty. In business, in land deals, in every conversation where his voice carried the final word. Yet the quiet weight of that seal had shifted something in the room that even he could not easily push back into place. He finally exhaled slowly and lifted his gaze toward Naya Redfeather. You said the judge spoke to the town. Ethan said, his tone more measured than before. But towns forget speeches faster than they forget droughts. A few men near the tables nodded faintly, relieved to hear his confidence returning, yet none of them laughed this time. Dr. Amos Klein rested his hand lightly on the bar, watching Ethan with the calm patience of someone who had already seen how certain evenings unfold. The judge knew that. The doctor replied quietly. That is why he left the seal behind. One of the ranch hands leaned forward, squinting at the token as if hoping the crest might reveal something new under the lantern light. So the seal proves the promise, the man said slowly. But promises still need someone to speak them out loud again. The bartender glanced at Naya and then back at the doctor. Is that why she came? He asked. Naya did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the saloon, meeting the eyes of several men who now seemed far less certain about the laughter that had filled the room earlier. Her gaze was calm, steady, almost patient. My mother told me something before she passed away, Naya said at last. She said a town does not lose its honor all at once. Ethan folded his arms again, listening despite himself. She said it disappears one quiet moment at a time. Naya continued, her voice carrying easily through the still room. A moment when someone chooses comfort instead of fairness. A moment when a promise becomes inconvenient. The doctor nodded slightly, as if he had heard the same wisdom before. The older ranch hand leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Your mother was a wise woman, he said. Naya lowered her eyes briefly toward the red wax seal resting on the wood. She believed the town was better than the stories people told about it, she said softly. Ethan studied her carefully now. The earlier certainty in his expression had not vanished, but something else had appeared beside it. Curiosity, perhaps even caution. And you believe the same thing, he said. Naya lifted the token again, turning it slowly between her fingers so the lantern light glowed across the wax crest. I believe the town deserves the chance to prove her right, she replied. The words settled across the room like a quiet challenge. No accusation, no demand, just an invitation that suddenly seemed impossible for the room to ignore. Dr. Klein looked toward the men sitting around the saloon, his voice gentle but clear. The judge once said that dignity does not belong to a document or a seal, he said. It belongs to the people who decide whether the promise still matters. The lantern flame flickered again, and for the first time that evening Ethan Blackwood realized that the decision might not belong to him alone. The lantern flame trembled slightly as another slow gust slipped through the saloon doors, and the quiet challenge Naya had left hanging in the room continued to settle over every man present. No one spoke immediately. The red wax seal rested on the bar between them, no bigger than a silver dollar, yet it now carried the kind of attention usually reserved for something far larger. Ethan Blackwood remained standing across from Naya Redfeather, his posture straight, his expression carefully composed. For years the town had grown used to his voice filling any silence that appeared in a room. Tonight the silence seemed to belong to someone else. Ethan's eyes moved across the faces around the saloon. Ranch hands, merchants, travelers, the bartender, and Dr. Amos Klein. Men who had laughed earlier now sat still, their gazes drifting back again and again to the small red seal. Ethan finally let out a slow breath and rested one hand on the edge of the bar. "You speak as though the town owes you something," he said, his tone controlled but no longer careless. Nia shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. "The town does not owe me anything." She lifted the token again, holding it where the lantern light touched the red wax crest. "But the town once made a promise." Dr. Klein nodded faintly, remembering. The bartender leaned forward, elbows on the counter now, curiosity replacing the hesitation he had shown earlier. "What exactly did the judge say that day?" the bartender asked quietly. The doctor looked toward the ceiling for a moment, as if searching through years of dust for the exact words. When he spoke again, his voice was calm and deliberate. He said that a town reveals its character not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it protects the dignity of those who stand alone. Several men shifted in their chairs. The older ranch hand at the back table rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Ethan listened without interrupting, though his jaw tightened slightly. "That sounds like a fine speech," Ethan said after a moment. "But speeches do not run a town." Dr. Klein looked back at him. "No," he agreed. "People do." The answer hung in the air like the slow toll of a distant bell. Nia placed the seal gently back onto the wood. "My mother told me the judge left the seal for a reason," she said. "He said a time might come when the town would need to remember his words." Ethan studied her carefully now, the confidence he carried still present but tempered by something more thoughtful. "And you believe tonight is that time?" he said. Nia did not answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the men sitting around the saloon. One by one, several of them met her eyes before looking away again, the weight of the moment settling more heavily than any order or command could have done. Finally, she spoke. "Tonight, I walked 20 miles across the desert to buy medicine for my younger brother," she said softly. "But when I stepped into this room, I heard laughter before I heard kindness." The bartender looked down at the counter. The older ranch hand shifted uncomfortably. Even the lantern seemed to burn a little quieter. Ethan's eyes returned to the red wax seal. For the first time that evening, he did not appear to be measuring the room as a man who owned it. Instead, he seemed to be measuring something inside himself. Dr. Klein watched him carefully. After a long moment, Ethan spoke again, his voice lower than before. "You came here to remind the town of its promise," he said. Nia nodded once. Ethan looked around the saloon again, this time not searching for loyalty, but for something else entirely. And as the quiet stretched across the room once more, every man present realized the moment of remembering had finally arrived. The saloon remained wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than the desert heat outside. The lantern above the bar burned steady now, its golden glow reflecting softly across the red wax seal resting between Nia Redfeather and Ethan Blackwood. For several long seconds no one moved. The moment had stretched beyond ordinary conversation and settled into something deeper, something every man in the room understood without needing to say it aloud. Ethan stood with one hand resting on the edge of the bar, his gaze drifting slowly across the faces around him. These were men who had shared drinks with him, worked cattle beside him, borrowed money from him, laughed at his jokes. Yet tonight their expressions had changed. Some looked thoughtful, some looked uneasy. None of them looked amused anymore. Ethan inhaled slowly and straightened his shoulders. "You walked 20 miles for medicine," he said at last, his voice quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. "And you carried that seal all the way here." Nia nodded once. "Yes." Ethan studied the token again, the faint red crest pressed into the wax, now glowing softly under the lantern light. "That is a long road for a reminder," he said. Nia did not argue. "My mother believed some reminders are worth the miles," she replied. Dr. Amos Klein shifted slightly beside the bar, his thoughtful eyes moving between them. The doctor had seen many evenings in this town, but something about this one felt different, as though a quiet crossroads had appeared that no one had expected to reach. From the back of the room, the older ranch hand cleared his throat. "Doctor," he said slowly, "you said the judge spoke about dignity." Dr. Klein nodded. "He did." "Then maybe it is time someone says those words again," the ranch hand continued. A few heads turned toward him. The man shifted his hat back on his head and leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. "Because I remember my father telling me something about that speech," he added. Ethan glanced toward him. listening now rather than dismissing the comment. The ranch hand continued carefully. My father said the judge told the town that dignity does not belong to the strongest voice in the room, he said. It belongs to the moment when the quietest person is finally heard. The bartender slowly placed a glass back on the shelf behind him. The faint sound of the glass touching would seem louder than usual in the stillness. Naya stood calmly, her hands resting beside the seal. She had not raised her voice once since she stepped into the saloon. Yet every man in the room now listened when she spoke. Ethan looked at her again, this time without the earlier confidence that had filled his words. If the town remembers tonight, he said slowly, what happens next? Naya considered the question for a moment. Then she gently picked up the small token once more. The red wax crest caught the lantern glow as she turned it between her fingers. Nothing happens to the past, she said quietly. But the next moment becomes different. Dr. Klein nodded softly at that. The ranch hand leaned back in his chair. The bartender watched the token with quiet respect now. Ethan remained still, his gaze resting on the seal. For the first time since the evening began, he seemed less like the man who controlled the room and more like someone standing inside a choice he could no longer ignore. And as the quiet stretched once more across the saloon, it became clear to everyone present that the next words spoken in that room would decide what kind of town they truly lived in. The lantern light inside the saloon seemed steadier now, as though the flame itself had decided to witness what came next. The red wax seal rested in Naya Redfeather's hand, its small crest glowing quietly under the warm light. Around the room the men remained still, the earlier laughter now nothing more than a memory drifting somewhere behind the moment they were standing in. Ethan Blackwood kept his eyes on the token for a long while. The man who had built half the fences in the valley, who owned more cattle than any rancher within 50 miles, suddenly found himself studying something that could not be bought, traded, or counted. The silence stretched until the faint creak of the saloon sign outside drifted through the door again. Ethan finally spoke, though his voice carried a different weight than before. You say the next moment becomes different, he said slowly. But moments do not change by themselves. Naya nodded slightly. No, she replied. People change them. Dr. Amos Klein watched the exchange with quiet attention, his hands folded lightly on the counter, as if he were listening to a story he had waited years to hear finished. Ethan lifted his gaze from the seal and looked around the room again. The ranch hand at the back table met his eyes calmly now. The bartender stood with both palms resting on the bar, no longer pretending to busy himself with glasses. Even the two travelers near the door leaned forward slightly, sensing the evening had reached a point that might be remembered long after it ended. Ethan returned his gaze to Naya. If the town chooses to remember tonight, he said, what does that look like? Naya held the seal between her fingers for a moment longer before placing it gently back onto the bar. The sound of the small metal piece touching wood seemed unusually clear. It looks simple, she said quietly. You remember that dignity is not a favor. Dr. Klein nodded faintly. It is the ground every promise stands on, the doctor added. The older ranch hand leaned forward again. My father used to say something close to that, he murmured. Ethan listened without interruption. The earlier confidence that once filled the room had softened into something more thoughtful. He rested both hands on the bar and looked directly at the red wax crest. When the judge spoke 20 years ago, he said slowly, this town was smaller. Fewer. Ranches, fewer people. Maybe promises were easier then. Naya considered his words before answering. Promises are never easier, she said. They are only remembered or forgotten. The bartender exhaled quietly at that. Outside the saloon a horse shifted its weight against the hitching rail, the faint sound of leather creaking in the night air. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the seal. For the first time since the conversation began, the richest rancher in the valley did not appear to be calculating his advantage. Instead, he seemed to be weighing something that belonged not to land or money, but to the kind of story a town tells about itself. Dr. Klein watched him carefully. Every town reaches a moment like this, the doctor said gently. The moment when the past asks whether the promise still matters. The lantern flickered again, reflecting across the red wax crest. Ethan Blackwood slowly reached toward the token. This time his hand did not move with careless confidence. It moved with deliberate caution, as though he understood that whatever he did next would echo far beyond the walls of the small desert saloon. The room watched Ethan Blackwood's hand move toward the red wax seal, as if the entire town had suddenly gathered inside those four wooden walls. His fingers hovered above the token for a moment, not touching it yet, simply acknowledging its presence. The lantern light glowed across the crest pressed into the wax, and for the first time that evening the object no longer looked small. It looked official, deliberate, old in the way that real promises often are. Ethan slowly picked it up between his fingers. The motion was careful, almost respectful, nothing like the casual reach he had made earlier in the night. The room remained silent. Dr. Amos Klein watched with the calm attention of a man who had waited many years to see whether a town would remember the words spoken long ago in front of its courthouse. The bartender leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the counter as he followed the movement of the seal. Even the ranch hand near the back table kept his eyes fixed on Ethan now, as if the rancher's next words might carry more weight than any speech the judge had given 2 decades earlier. Ethan turned the token slowly between his fingers, studying the crest impressed into the hardened wax. The mark had been pressed firmly, leaving sharp edges that had survived 20 years of dust and distance. "A judge placed this seal into your mother's hand," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying across the room without needing to rise. Nia Redfeather nodded. "Yes." Ethan looked at her carefully. The young woman who had walked 20 miles across the desert stood with the same calm posture she had held since she stepped inside the saloon. She had not demanded anything. She had not raised her voice. Yet the entire room had shifted around the quiet strength of her presence. Ethan lowered his gaze back to the token. "And the judge said the town would remember its promise if the seal ever returned," he said. Nia answered softly. "He said the seal would remind people who they were supposed to be." Ethan let out a slow breath. The lantern light flickered gently against the metal edge of the token as he placed it back onto the bar in front of her. This time the motion carried none of the dismissive confidence from earlier. It was deliberate, measured. "Then the seal has done its job tonight," he said. The bartender glanced toward Dr. Klein. The older ranch hand sat forward in his chair. The travelers by the door exchanged a quiet look. The words had not sounded like surrender. They sounded like recognition. Ethan rested both hands on the bar and looked directly at Nia. "You said you walked 20 miles for medicine," he said. "Is your brother waiting tonight?" Nia nodded once. "Yes." Ethan turned his head toward the bartender. "Get the medicine she came for," he said calmly. The bartender did not hesitate this time. He moved quickly to the shelf behind the counter, retrieving the small bottle the young woman had originally come to buy. When he placed it on the bar, Ethan slid a few coins across the wood beside it. The bartender hesitated, glancing between the money and the red wax seal. Ethan noticed the look and shook his head slightly. "Not a payment," he said. "Just a man making sure the right thing happens before the night ends." Nia picked up the bottle gently. For the first time since entering the saloon, a faint warmth appeared in her expression, not quite a smile, but something close to relief. Ethan looked around the room once more, meeting the eyes of the men who had witnessed the evening unfold. "A town does not prove its character through speeches," he said quietly. "It proves it in moments like this." And as the red wax seal rested once more in Nia Redfeather's hand, every man in the room understood that the promise made 20 years earlier had finally been remembered. For several seconds after Ethan Blackwood spoke, the saloon remained quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence that follows a decision once it has been made. Nia Redfeather held the small bottle of medicine in one hand and the red wax seal in the other. The lantern light shimmered softly across the glass bottle, and the crest pressed into the wax, reflecting the quiet end of a moment that had begun with laughter and ended with something far more meaningful. Ethan remained standing at the bar, his hands resting on the wood as he looked down for a moment, not at the seal this time, but at the grain of the old counter that had witnessed more stories than any man in the room could count. Dr. Amos Klein studied him with thoughtful eyes. The doctor had seen many men hold power, and he had seen many men refuse to let it go. But what he had just witnessed was something rarer. A man choosing what kind of story he would allow the town to remember about him. The bartender wiped the counter slowly, though it was already clean, his eyes occasionally lifting toward Nia and the seal she held. The ranch hand at the back table leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with a quiet nod that suggested the evening had turned out better than he expected. Naya placed the red wax seal carefully into the small pocket inside her coat. The movement was gentle, almost ceremonial, as if she were returning a memory to its rightful place. Then she picked up the bottle of medicine and held it close for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried sincerity that filled the room in a way no raised voice ever could. Ethan lifted his gaze again. The earlier pride that had colored his expression at the start of the evening had softened into something steadier. "Your brother should have that medicine before the night grows colder," he said. "The desert air can turn sharp after midnight." Naya nodded. "I will start the walk back soon." The bartender looked toward the door and then back at her with concern. 20 miles in the dark is a long road," he said. Naya gave a small calm smile. "I walked it once already today." Dr. Klein cleared his throat gently. "If you do not mind a little company for the first few miles, I have a horse outside," he offered. Naya looked at him with gratitude. "That would help." Ethan glanced toward the door where the desert night waited beyond the wooden threshold. The same road Naya had traveled that day stretched far beyond the town limits, winding through sand and sage under a sky full of stars. He then looked back at the men in the room. "Sometimes a town does not notice the moment it becomes better," he said quietly. "But tonight we might remember." The ranch hand nodded once. The bartender placed both hands on the bar and looked toward the door with a thoughtful expression. Dr. Klein picked up his hat and rested it against his chest. Naya stepped toward the door with the small bottle safely in her hand. Before she left, she turned once more toward the room. No anger, no triumph, just a calm understanding. Then she stepped into the cool desert night. The swinging doors moved slowly behind her, letting the wind slip briefly through the room before settling again. Inside the saloon, Ethan Blackwood stood quietly beside the bar, the echo of the evening still lingering in the lantern light, and every man present understood that the promise made 20 years earlier had not only been remembered. It had quietly shaped the kind of town they would wake up in tomorrow. Outside the saloon, the desert night had fully settled over the town, stretching wide and quiet beneath a sky filled with cold, bright stars. The wooden doors swung once more and then slowly came to rest, leaving the warm lantern glow inside the room behind them. For a moment, no one inside spoke. The wind carried faint sounds of hooves and distant coyotes across the dark valley, reminders that the world beyond the town still moved with the same steady rhythm it always had. Dr. Amos Klein stepped out onto the wooden porch a few moments after Naya Redfeather, guiding his horse gently beside her. The lantern light from inside the saloon spilled across the dirt road for a few feet before fading into the silver glow of the moon. Naya adjusted the small bottle of medicine safely inside her coat and placed her hand briefly against the pocket where the red wax seal rested. The road stretched long and pale through the desert, the same 20 miles she had walked earlier that day. Dr. Klein looked toward the horizon and then back at her. "Your mother would have been proud tonight," he said softly. Naya looked up at the stars for a moment before answering. "She believed the town would remember," she said. The doctor nodded slowly and handed her the reins of the horse. Then perhaps tonight proved she was right. Inside the saloon, Ethan Blackwood remained standing near the bar, his eyes resting on the quiet doorway through which Naya had just disappeared. The room had grown calm again. The ranch hand leaned back in his chair, the bartender wiped the counter with slow, thoughtful movements, and the travelers near the door had returned to their drinks. Yet the air inside the saloon felt different than it had earlier that evening. Something invisible had shifted, something no one could measure, but everyone could feel. Ethan finally stepped away from the bar and moved toward the door, stopping just outside, where the cool desert breeze brushed against his coat. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the doctor's horse moving slowly along the pale road, carrying Naya Redfeather away from the town that had nearly forgotten its own promise. Ethan stood there quietly, watching until the shape disappeared into the dark hills. The stars above the valley seemed brighter now, scattered across the sky like silent witnesses to the long history of the land. After a moment, he spoke softly to no one in particular. "A town remembers who it is when someone reminds it what it promised." Behind him, the bartender heard the words and nodded quietly. The ranch hand glanced toward the door with a faint, thoughtful smile. And though no one in that saloon would speak about it loudly the next day, Every man present knew that the story of that evening would travel through the valley in the quiet way true stories always do, not as a tale of conflict or victory, but as a reminder that dignity, once remembered, has a way of guiding the road ahead. And far out along that desert trail, beneath a sky that seemed wide enough to hold every promise ever made, Naya Redfeather rode toward home carrying medicine for her brother and the quiet certainty that sometimes the smallest seal can awaken the largest memory in a town.